Delegates from Ukraine and Russia arrive in Istanbul for face-to-face talks as the United Nations calls for an immediate ceasefire. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. After 5 weeks of intense fighting, negotiations will resume on Tuesday between delegations from Russia and Ukraine in Turkey. On Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country was ready to discuss neutral status, but any deal would need to be validated by a referendum. Russian airstrikes have devastated cities across Ukraine. The mayor of Mariupol is calling for a complete evacuation of his besieged city. The United Nations reports nearly 4 million Ukrainians have now fled the country. For more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He's a chair professor at Soochow University. From London, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is a historian and author specializing in Russia and the former USSR. Here in Washington, D.C., Eugene Chausovsky is a geopolitical analyst, and Kira Riddick is a member of the Parliament of Ukraine. She joins us from Kiev. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Kira Riddick, let me start with you. As I said at the beginning of the show, delegations are now back in Istanbul, in Turkey, delegations from Ukraine and Russia to try and bring an end to this conflict. And President Zelensky says Ukraine is now ready to accept neutral, non-nuclear status. He's also said he's willing to compromise on some territorial issues. So how do you see it? Is this some kind of an opening that could bring an end to the violence?
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. So, no, I do not believe that any of these ideas would bring peace to Ukraine. I would like to remind everybody that in 2014, when Putin invaded Ukraine for the first time, we did have a neutral status, and it didn't stop him. And the second question is, who would be the guarantee of that Putin will keep his part of the bargain? As of right now, we know exactly a couple of things. First, Putin is known for not keeping his word. And we can see it during this war, during the previous 8 years of war in Ukraine, during all the deals that we had with him before. Second thing, what we know is that for the last 30 years, every single country where Russians would bring their troops, these troops wouldn't be pulled back. So that is why we are very much ready to the understanding that within the next year or so, every single soldier that came onto Ukrainian land will have to die here, and he will not be pulled away. And right now, I do not see a line of world leaders who are coming along and saying, we would like to be the guarantees that Putin will keep his word. And this is why there is nothing that we can negotiate with him. Moreover, we cannot negotiate giving up our territories. And the neutral status that President Zelensky was talking about is not up to him. It is up to Ukrainian parliament or to Ukrainian people, because these are the changes to the constitution, and they are voted not by the president. They are voted by the parliament or referendum of Ukrainian people. Referendums cannot be held during the war. So it all gets back to ceasefire and then like all the discussions. And as a person who lives in the country that was in war with Russia for 8 years, and we were not able to get a single thing from Putin, this ceasefire, I do not believe that we will be able to get it right now.
So you were saying that negotiations can only take place once a ceasefire has been declared?
Right, and when there are guarantees, the security guarantees from other countries, NATO countries, non-NATO countries, that Putin will keep his word. Without that, it's just like useless spending of everybody's time. And I can tell you how Russia was preparing for these peaceful negotiations. First, they closed all the humanitarian convoys for the last 3 days. Second, they were firing missiles to the borders with Poland right when President Biden was speaking there. And third, they are evacuating and kidnapping women and children for their exchange pool. So, like, why would anybody in the world think that they are preparing for peace?
Right. So, Kira, the Russians want Ukraine to declare its neutrality to assure Moscow that it will not be joining NATO. That would require a change in the constitution, which in turn would require a referendum in the country. I mean, can those things happen under these circumstances?
No, they cannot. By Ukrainian laws, a referendum cannot happen during the war. So we are back to the question with the ceasefire. And the changes to constitution can happen through the parliament, again, which cannot happen during the martial law, which is implemented. So it all brings us back to the ceasefire.
Okay.
And again, for 8 years, I haven't seen Putin's forces to be able to implement ceasefire, and I would not believe that right now.
All right, I want to go to London now to Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Dr. Papadopoulos, Ukraine's president has called for direct talks with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. We did get a response from the Russians. This is the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. This is what he said about that offer, that proposal.
A meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is needed and should happen as soon as we have clarity on agreeing on key issues. We've been raising the awareness of these issues for many years, but the West hasn't listened to us. Finally, they've heard us.
So, Dr. Papadopoulos, just as we heard from our guest in Kiev, a ceasefire first, then negotiations. Do you believe that direct talks between President Zelensky and President Vladimir Putin could pave the way for some kind of settlement?
War is the greatest catastrophe which can befall mankind. And I very much hope that President Zelensky and President Putin will meet in person to try and resolve the conflict which is plaguing Ukraine. However, Zelensky is not an independent player. As a result of the American-engineered coup in Kiev in February of 2014 against the democratically elected leader Viktor Yanukovych, whose election victory in 2010 was recognized by both the United States of America and the European Union, Ukraine has been a vassal state of the West's. The American-engineered coup in Ukraine destroyed Ukraine's relationship with Russia. That is why the people of the Crimea rose up against the new regime in Kiev. That is why the people of Donetsk Oblast and Lugansk Oblast rose up against the new regime in Kiev. Zelensky is merely a puppet. The Americans are using Zelensky and they are using Ukraine as a way of trying to decimate Russia's status as a superpower, to return Russia to how it was during the 1990s, namely a pauper state in which the Americans ruled the international scene without any challenge whatsoever. All that we have seen from the Americans and, of course, the British in the last 5 weeks has not been about the welfare of the Ukrainian population. No, Ukraine is merely a tool to the West, a tool to use against Russia, a way of weakening Russia in Europe and thereby weakening Russia in the world in general, and as a way of preserving and strengthening American global hegemony. To argue that the Americans genuinely care about the people of Ukraine is completely untenable. It is preposterous nonsense. The Americans and the British have been, via Saudi Arabia, waging a war against the people of Yemen for 7 years now. That is the greatest humanitarian crisis in contemporary times. Over 200,000 Yemeni men, women and children have died. And yet there is no concern from Washington or London about that.
Kira, let me get your response to that, especially the point that Dr. Papadopoulos made on the fact that the United States and NATO don't really have Ukraine's welfare at heart here.
Well, there is many points that were made that I would like to respond to. Well, first of all, regarding the elections and the president that were elected. As a person who is Ukrainian member of parliament, democratically elected parliament, I can only object to that and say that Ukraine right now is showing the whole world what the democracy means, and all our governments and presidents and parliaments are accepted by all the leaders of the world and all the democratic countries. So,
Kira, hasn't your president just banned 11 political parties and shut down television stations?
No, that's not correct. He shut down the pro-Russian parties that I actually voted for this shutdown as well. They should have been actually banned a while ago. They are working for an aggressor that is killing our people on the streets, and they should not be able to operate in Ukraine. I truly support that. And as a leader of oppositional party, Ukrainian oppositional party, I can tell you that our party is operating in Ukraine right now and operating in the parliament normally, because we work for our country and not for the country that is trying to destroy us.
All right, I want to move on to some of our other guests. Victor Gar, let me go to you in Beijing. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he's made a very impassioned call for an end to the fighting and for talks. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Let's be clear. The solution to this humanitarian tragedy is not humanitarian. It is political. I'm therefore appealing for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to allow for progress in serious political negotiations aiming at reaching a peace agreement based on the principles of the United Nations Charter.
So, Victor, there's that call there from the United Nations Secretary General for a ceasefire, for peace talks to start. But what are we to make of the fact that neither the United Nations, nor NATO, nor the United States, nor the EU for that matter, seem to be acting with any urgency to get peace talks going?
Well, I think what's happening in Ukraine is truly a great human tragedy and need to be discontinued as quickly as possible. Now, this is the time for the greatest level, highest level of diplomacy and human wisdom and vision. I think for the war to be continued, which will take more tolls on the civilian lives in Ukraine and really create unprecedented damage to all the landmarks, properties, buildings, you name it, it is truly a horror for mankind to go through. Now, on the other hand, apparently, while the war is going on between Russia and the Ukraine, the reality of the fact, and let's be honest about it, is between Russia on the one hand and Ukraine, plus the United States and NATO behind it. And therefore, whatever solution there will be, we'll need to really bring all these parties together. Now, for Ukraine, of course, they have their own demands, which need to be listened to. However, you have a war going on in Ukraine. Your top priority is to save Ukrainian people. Now, I'm very concerned about certain countries in the world which keep providing arms to Ukraine and urge the Ukrainian people to stand and fight until the last Ukrainian standing. This is completely a shame for Ukraine. I think right now the key is to save as many Ukrainian people. Those who want to die, they go to there and to die in themselves, rather than urging the civilians in Ukraine to die. This is unfair to the civilians of Ukraine. We need to save the civilians in Ukraine. We need to bring the war to an end. To bring a war to an end, you need compromises by all parties concerned. Compromises to be made by Russia, compromises to be made by Ukraine, and whoever who are backing it up militarily from behind.
Victor, Kira Riddick also raised an important issue when she was talking to us earlier, in which she said, look, you can have an agreement, but who's going to be the guarantor of such an agreement? And what role do you see for China in this?
First of all, I think NATO membership should be the dead end, and I think everyone needs to acknowledge that, including the United States and all the NATO member states. Now, the key is not Ukraine will not join NATO today or in the coming few years. No, it will be no NATO membership at all for NATO. Ukraine need to really demonstrate their own wisdom, a belief in being Ukraine themselves. Ukraine is part of human civilization. They should be proud of that. And therefore, I think the greatest value of Ukraine is being part of the connectivity on the Eurasian landmass to create more value, to become a part of the connectivity between the East and the West, North and the South.
Right, Victor,
China is very happy to do the mediation, but you need to have the consent of both Russia as well as Ukraine, as well as all those parties behind Ukraine.
Yeah.
You cannot just do a solo dancing right now. It takes two to tango. For this settlement of the war in Ukraine, you need more than two to tango.
Eugene Chasovsky, great to have you with us. President Biden, of course, has just returned from his trip to Europe. He held that triple summit in Europe, the G7, and with NATO and with the European Union. And then, of course, he went to Poland. And shortly before he departed Poland to come back to the United States, he made a speech in Poland. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
So, Eugene, that last comment there that the president made was widely interpreted as a desire to oust the president of Russia, regime change, as it's called at times. The White House and the president have since walked that back. In fact, the president had said that he was just expressing his personal outrage at what was going on. But did he actually make things worse?
Well, I think that Biden's comments should be seen in the context of what he was talking about, which is the Russian war in Ukraine and Russia's aggressive actions in the country. But I think we should look at this in terms of the geopolitical interests of all of the sides involved. So for Russia, it's obviously seeking to establish or hold on to the sphere of influence in Ukraine and elsewhere. And for the U.S. and NATO, they want to essentially counter that Russian attempts. And unfortunately, it's Ukraine that suffers as a result of these, of this competition for influence. But I think to the earlier points about negotiations and a potential ceasefire, I think ultimately there will have to be some kind of compromise from both the Russian side and Ukrainian side in order for any ceasefire to be implemented. Now, Ukraine has made very clear that it's open to negotiating the status, and that will have to depend on a referendum as well on neutrality and NATO membership. But it does need some security guarantees from Western countries, especially the U.S., in order to make sure that any kind of agreement isn't broken in the future. So ultimately, that needs to happen in the diplomatic stage. But right now, the negotiations are unfortunately happening militarily.
Eugene, one of the points on the president's visit, I mean, it was a big visit with this triple summit, as I mentioned, and with the visit to Poland. It seemed to provide a lot of photo ops for the president. What did it actually achieve for the Ukrainian people, their plight and their suffering?
Well, I think it reflected the level of support that the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government is getting from the West. So we've seen, obviously, security support. We've seen economic, financial support, although NATO and the U.S. has made very clear that they're not going to be directly involved in the fighting on the ground, as that would risk a direct Russia-NATO confrontation. But what Biden's visit to both Poland and Brussels shows is that Ukraine has solidarity with the West, that the West will continue to support Ukraine in the ways that I mentioned, as long as Russia continues its military operations. And so that support will be unwavering until hopefully a diplomatic resolution can be made.
Kira Riddick, I want to get your view on a belief, and we see this in many places. We hear many analysts say this, many commentators say that this is actually a war, a conflict between the United States and Russia. and Ukraine is paying for it?
I think it is much bigger. It's a conflict right now between the previous institutions that are proved to be weak and unable to keep the peace in the whole world that they intended to do, like United Nations, like NATO. Second, this is a conflict between like their movement to the past and to the future. When Putin is saying that he's rebuilding the Russian Empire, he's rebuilding USSR, whatever he's doing, we are moving towards the future. We are moving towards the European Union, building the digital system, the digital country, etc. Third, it's a conflict between democracy and democratic countries like Ukraine and tyrannies like Russia and its allies, if any. And here this conflict lies not between concrete countries, but between the values and the visions. And unfortunately, Putin decided that he wants to keep his influence on Ukraine. Ukrainian people in 2014 decided that we do not want to have Russia's influence because we know and we have like a very good experience on how it turns out. And then we want to move towards the European Union, and this is what we kept doing. We were very successful in that, and of course this was a threat to Putin's regime, which we right now see unwraps.
Given what we've seen over the past month, Kira, do you accept now that the likelihood of Ukraine moving towards the European Union or becoming a member of NATO is now highly unlikely?
We will still continue moving towards the European Union and away from Russia. You cannot even believe how destroyed and mentally disabled Russian people are. And we knew this for a very long time. And this is why we wanted never to have anything to do with them and never to do anything with Russia.
Right.
This is why we always wanted to move towards the development, towards the European Union. And this is why I don't see even a way for things to return back. Right now, almost like a third of population of Ukraine is armed. Yeah. And given like the any of idea that we would have to have some peace deals or agreements with Russia will create like more and more fighting from our side, in particular from people who are supporting a democracy, who are supporting their own choices and ability to go with their own will.
Okay, Dr. Papadopoulos, Russia has, of course, been the victim, or at least the target, of thousands of sanctions that have been imposed on the country by the United States and by Europe. But President Putin is playing hardball right now in response to these US sanctions, to these European sanctions. He's now telling people who buy Russian gas and Russian oil that, and he's telling people whom he calls hostile customers that they will now have to pay for Russian oil and gas in rubles. Germany has already said, well, it's not going to be doing that. What is President Putin's strategy here?
Ever since the American-engineered coup in Kiev in February of 2014, the Russians were preparing for some sort of military action in Ukraine. I said so then, and I have been saying so over the last 8 years. And the Kremlin was very aware that in that scenario, the West, led by America and Britain, would impose on Russia the greatest and most potent sanctions that the West has ever imposed on another country in its history. And yet, after 5 weeks of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, the Russian economy remains very stable. So much so that President Putin has made it very clear to countries in Europe which have adopted a hostile approach towards Russia and which are reliant on Russian natural gas, that they will have to pay in rubles henceforth. That demonstrates that the Russian economy is holding up against the weight of tremendous Western sanctions. And I also want to make a very important point for your audience. The views of the guest in Kiev represent some of the population in Ukraine, principally in the westernmost regions of Ukraine, specifically Lvov, Ternopil and Ivano-Frankivsk.
I'm in Kiev.
Her views are anathema to many people in the rest of Ukraine, such as in Kharkov, such as in the Donbass, such as in Zaporozhye, such as in Kherson, and such as in Odessa. Her views only are represented by people in the westernmost part of Ukraine. Millions of people in eastern Ukraine and in southeastern Ukraine regard themselves as part of the Russian world. Indeed, much of the Ukrainian population are members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. That is something you will never hear from Western mainstream media.
Yeah. Okay, Kira, very quick response. I want to get to our other two guests, so I'd be grateful if you could keep this brief.
Okay, first of all, I'm a member of Ukrainian parliament and represent the whole country. Second,
you represent Moscow.
Second, the regions that you mentioned were specifically hit by Russians. So now they pay for their pro-Russian views because Russians came and destroyed people who were and killed people who were speaking Russian and who actually supported Russian. So I hope that will be. My country, it will be a fantastic vaccine against anything Russian that will come by. And third, I'm initiating the law to close the Russian church here in Ukraine as well, because we don't need that pieces of pro-Russian propaganda in our country.
All right, I need to. All right,
much of the Ukrainian population are members of the Russian Orthodox Church. That's your stance.
Okay, I need.
So they will be never.
All right, I need to get to Beijing, to Victor Gao.
Members of.
We're running out of time. I need to get to Victor Gao. Victor, the United States is turning up the pressure on China to resist any requests for help from Moscow. How is China responding to that?
Well, China has very good relations with Russia. We also have deeply rooted relations with Ukraine. This whole war or military operations in Ukraine really traumatized China. Now, China can offer negotiations and mediation to Russia and Ukraine and whoever who stands behind Ukraine. Any pressure from the United States on China will backfire. Why? Because China is already a larger economy than the United States by purchasing power parity. China is the largest trading partner with more than 130 nations in the world. If U.S. wants to sanction China for its stance for peace, saving Ukrainian people, the United States will push the global economy into a deep recession, and they will commit really the largest crime against economic growth of mankind.
And that's where we have to leave it. Eugene, I'm sorry. I would have liked to have got back to you, but time has run out. But thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.